This is Sigmund Freud again, the great psychiatrist, who was a great psychiatrist. And he said, the great question which I have not yet been able to answer, despite 30 years of research into the female soul, is what does woman want? That is extraordinary, isn't it? And there was old Mel Gibson making a fool of himself, still not answering the question what women want. He thought it was cosmetics or something. The ignorance of what a woman wants is amazing, isn't it? So for all men who might not know what women want, woman only needs to be loved. Now there's a big difference between wanting and needing. So the language is wrong there. All women want to be loved. But the question is, does she need to be loved? And if she needs to be loved, then that love usually comes to her as a need, because we need to breathe, and while it's provided, we have the air is provided. While we need to eat, the food is provided. You don't have to want to eat. While it's provided, your need is provided. But a woman to need to be loved has to be able to be loved. It's no good her being her emotional self, her demanding self, her wanting self, her preconceived self. It's no good her doing that if she we call it, wants to be loved, because man's not going to be able to love her. A woman has to be surrendered to God in the same way as a man has to be surrendered to God. And as God is nothing, if I were giving this talk out in the main street of the Gold Coast, they'd say, what are you talking about? How can I be surrendered to nothing? But you and I know that this nothing that I'm speaking of is something beyond description inside. And that is what I need to surrender to, and never to the man and never to the woman. But man tends to want woman to surrender to him. And woman, in her ignorance, sometimes wants man to surrender to her. And you can't do it that way, because that will end in suppression of the natural love, and it will come up somewhere as conflict in both or either of them. So you have to be worthy of loving to be loved, and that applies to both of us, man and woman. And you can't take a position, because if you take a position, you're not innocent and you're not humble before God. Because in inner space, the only positions are up the top here, where you are something, where I am something, reflecting on something. But when I reflect on nothing but the pure mirror, or the pure psyche, as it were, I can't take a position, because there's nothing there, because I'm nothing in that place. So in any loving relationship, where both agree that we're going to endeavour to make this work by giving up as much as possible ourselves, then it's very easy to see when somebody is taking, or one or the other is taking a position. So you might examine in your own experience, which is what we're talking about here, aren't we? Every day. In your own experience, in your relationship, it should be self-evident to you that if you are insisting on anything, you are taking a position. And that if you argue, the two of you argue, then one or both is taking a position. And the extraordinary psychological sting is that as soon as one takes a position, the other, as a defensive action, will necessarily take a position too. And then they will be diametrically opposed. Because if there's no position, there's no opposition. But to do that, you have to surrender to God, to this unknowable place within you. You have to be humble before God, not humble before man or woman. And there's a fine distinction there. So to be loved, you have to put God first before your love of man or before your love of woman. Otherwise, it will not endure. You will take a position if you don't put God first. Now, am I making sense, please? Please, I have to make sense to you. It has to make sense in your own experience. Do you see that if you take a position, it's different, it's not a position to ask a question. That is not a position. Everyone is free to ask a question of the other, because that's not a position. But if you start insisting after asking the question that the other is wrong, if you start insisting, then you're in danger of taking a position. And that's where arguments start, isn't it? But you have to go through arguments. Now, the truth of it all in your own experience, and this is what we've got to talk about, is that in your relationships, you have all been through arguments. You've all been through taking positions. You've all been through being emotional either side. Even if the man doesn't appear to be emotional, he's forceful, and that's emotional. Now, you've been through that. So therefore, I'm not speaking about something that's not in your experience. But are you going to continue to do that? Or are you going to learn from your experience, your own experience, to not take a position and put God first? Well, there is nothing like surrendering to God in any situation to purify your own self. When I was editor of the Sunday Mirror in Sydney, I had a very hard man on top of me who was editorial director, who was a friend of the Baron Ezra Norton, who was one of the last newspaper barons. And he was very hard on me. And he said, he used to ride me all the time because he said, I'm going to make you the best editor there ever was in this city. Because he imagined himself to have been the best editor in the city once, you see. So he started to ride me very hard. And the only way I could handle it, thank God, and it was the only way I could handle it, was to surrender to God and let him do his worst while I just surrendered to God. And he'd say, go on, he'd say to me, it's about one of the staff who was a professional friend of mine and chief sub-editor. He'd say, sack him. I want him sacked. I want him sacked. And I'd say, no, you sack him. I'm not going to sack him. Well, that was a straightforward, you sack him. I'm not going to sack him just because you want me to sack him. Because there's no reason to sack him. He was just being, like men in power often are. And then he said to me, well, you resign, go on. You resign, at another time. And I'm surrendering to God all the time because I'm a Leo, and and that makes it even harder to surrender except to God. But I said, no, you sack me. Because it would have cost him some, you see, because I had a contract. Because that was the fact. You sacked me. But it was a funny thing because later on when I was offered the job of, I'm just telling you this so that you know how things work, that things come together in God's mind where you really live. When I was offered the job of press secretary to the leader of the opposition in New State Government in New South Wales, which I took, and I asked this guy, Sir Robert Askin, I said to him, what? Why did you give me the job? He said, so-and-so, which was the editorial director, gave you such a wonderful reference. Well, there you go. I mean, you can't judge the situation, can you? You just got to surrender to God, leave it to God, and God will work it out. So I just tell you that because it's all right now as long as I surrender to God. As long as I say, okay, I surrender to God. I don't have to surrender to any man or woman, but that makes me humble. In other words, the corollary of this is that God's in charge, somehow or other. And that's something that all of us have to finally admit to. And it's best not to be brought to your knees to realize that. Because God has a way we can use these expressions, about God. He or she who God loves most, God brings to his or her knees. What sort of a love's that? Well, you got to be broken, you see. You got to surrender to God. And if you're surrendered to start with, then you don't have to be broken, do you? It's yourself, it's the positions that we take, that I'm right. And no one's right in an argument. No one's right in war. No one.